So we have to think about this for just a second. As Jefferson becomes the President of the United States, there is also an emerging American society at the time. First, we could say there's definitely a Southern aristocracy that's growing in the southern states during this period, right? And that really came out of the period before. In other words, we saw small farmers or yeoman farmers in the American South, but we also began to see the emergence of large-scale plantations. Keep in mind, the cotton gin is one of America's first patented inventions. By the time Jefferson becomes President of the United States, we begin to see cotton becoming one of the most marketable American agricultural items to the rest of the world. The other thing that happens during the Jefferson years, right, is we see the creation or the development of the Clermont, right, which is the first steamship by Robert Fulton. We also see the building of America's first roads that occurred during the 1790s, but are expanded, the national road system under Jefferson, right? And we also see the emergence later after the War of 1812 with America's first textile industries. We see that in the future. We're not quite there yet, okay? However, as Jefferson becomes president, right, Americans are moving into the West, and we're beginning to challenge Native Americans even more so for those lands in the West. New states come into the Union in the West during the Jefferson years. And we also bring the importation of African slaves to an end during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. During the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, we challenged the Barbary Coast pirates of North Africa for the first time. This is the first use of the United States Marine Corps in combat for the first time in 1803, 1804, and 1805. Washington and Adams had always paid the Barbary Coast pirates an indemnity or a bribe, right, to not attack American shipping into the Mediterranean Sea. Rather than pay the bribe, Jefferson sends the U.S. Marines to deal with them, right? We have to understand something about Jefferson. Even though Washington was a military man and Jefferson was not, Jefferson has this sense, right, of not spending as much money in the federal government. We're going to get to this here in a moment. But rather than spend the money, spend the bribe, right? Jefferson actually sends U.S. warships to deal with this situation. By the way, it's the first time that the Americans become militarily involved in the Middle East, okay, and in North Africa in dealing with Islamic countries. Although I wouldn't call North Africa the Middle East at all, I would certainly say that it's the first foray into the Muslim world that is made by American forces. I think it's a better way, more accurate way of putting it, okay? What does Jeffersonian democracy mean? Jeffersonian democracy means this, at least in theory, right? That you would cut taxes. This should sound familiar to you guys, right? That you would have a smaller federal government by spending less, right? And that the government therefore would be more responsive to the people, and the states would actually be more responsive for their citizens than the federal government. You would spend less on the military. In fact, Jefferson believed that, in essence, that state militias were much more important than having a federal standing army, and he didn't believe, aside from having a small and efficient navy, and having a large naval fleet at all, right? It's interesting, Madison, his successor in the presidency, wanted to actually rent a navy from Portugal rather than spend money on having one here, okay? Now, Jeffersonian democracy also meant something else. Jefferson thought that the most virtuous citizens were America's farmers, right? And that's because America's farmers provided for themselves, but in the early 19th century provided for everybody else within American society too, right? We have to think about this for a moment. Jefferson's not anti-manufacturing. He's not anti-industry. He's not necessarily anti-city. But he did believe that cities bred vice, that they bred corruption, right? he's not unlike conservative thinking in that mindset today. But Jefferson also believed what? Jefferson believed not just in an agrarian America, but in an expansionist America. And what's interesting about Jefferson is this. He actually wanted to educate and assimilate the Native Americans as the country grew westward. And it's Jefferson, ironically, that uses Hamilton's National Bank to fund the greatest project in American history up to this point to do just that. In 1803, Jefferson's administration buys the Louisiana Territory. This more than doubles the size of the United States for $15 million. It's one of the great real estate deals in history. How did it happen, though? Well, we have to throw into the mix, right, that the Napoleonic Wars are occurring in Europe during this time. And Napoleon himself wants a lucrative empire, specifically where you could get agricultural resources like sugar from the Caribbean. Haiti, a French colony in the Caribbean, or Santo Domingo at this point in time, right? It's about to become the Republic of Haiti. Saint Domingue is one of the wealthiest sugar-producing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. It's owned by the French. Napoleon has to deal with an uprising, a Haitian revolution. He sends a number of troops to put that revolution on the island of Saint Domingue down. However, those troops are defeated by the Haitians themselves. While the Jefferson administration offers no support to the revolution in Haiti, one thing that's very interesting to us is that when Napoleon's troops are defeated on the island of Saint Domingue, he wants to have nothing to do with an empire in North America either. Hence, Napoleon being willing to sell Louisiana, all of it, after reacquiring it in 1800 to the United States in 1803. There's another thing at work. Napoleon needs the money to fight the wars on the European continent that he has embroiled France within at the time. What may interest you is that the Americans only want the port city of New Orleans so that they can have free navigation through the American heartland down the Mississippi River. Napoleon sells them the greatest real estate deal in American history up to this point in time, okay? And what does that do? Well, it exacerbates some tensions in America that are already brewing, right, over the issue of expansion. Now, they're not the issues that we will see after the War of 1812, but they certainly set up the conditions for those issues as slavery expands into the West and commercial farming expands into the growing Midwest during this period in time, north of what we would refer to as the Mason-Dixon line. Jefferson is the architect of the problem, to some extent, that we see with the North-South divide that not only begins during the 1790s and extends into his administration and becomes a major issue for the first time during the era of good feelings. But Jefferson set up those conditions. Remember, before the Constitution was written, Jefferson authored the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. Boy, I hope you guys are writing that down because it's not on the board, and it probably should be. It probably should be with the Articles of Confederation. We probably should put the Northwest Ordinance here. I spent time talking about the Constitution yesterday and linking the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation to it. But the Northwest Ordinance is real key for us. What the Northwest Ordinance, which was written in 1787, at the same time as the Constitution was, it's the last major piece of legislation passed under the Articles of Confederation government. What the Northwest Ordinance essentially did was this. It said that all new states coming into the Union north of the Ohio River could not have the institution of slavery as a part of the process of their development. So that meant as the country grew westward that slavery would grow south of the Ohio River, and a free market economy based on commercial farming and small-time manufacturing would grow north of the Ohio River. So Jefferson sort of sets up the North-South dynamic that will eventually lead to the Civil War by 1861, okay? But the Louisiana Purchase territory also becomes a part of that process because later, as the country expands westward, the question is going to become, should slavery also expand westward, right? We have to think for a moment, when Jefferson ends his tenure as the President of the United States, right, he also ended his tenure with a series of very controversial acts, okay? Now, we refer to those, I don't know if you want me to write them down, but they go under economics, right? These are called the Embargo Acts. The Embargo and Non-Importation Acts of 1807. You see, because the United States remained neutral during the Napoleonic Wars between France and Great Britain, both sides start seizing American sailors on the high seas. Jefferson, wanting to prevent this, says, well, we're not going to provide any sort of assistance to either side. We're going to stay neutral, right? And we're not going to trade with either France or Great Britain, so therefore none of our ships are going to get seized. Sounds good, doesn't it? Sounds like you're preventing something bad from happening to American sailors. The only problem is you're also wrecking the economy of a part of the country that is ideologically opposed to you as well. You see, New England's economy was based on port cities and shipping. Now, all of a sudden, the Jefferson administration is shutting off trade, particularly to Great Britain, but also to France. Well, that meant that New England shipping came to a halt, and so did the American economy. It's true. In 1808, Jefferson does end the importation of slaves from West Africa. But in 1807, the year before, and throughout 1808, the American economy sank in Jefferson's final years of his second term in office. And while Jefferson became unpopular, he wasn't unpopular enough to weigh down his successor, his Secretary of State, James Madison, from becoming the next President of the United States, another Virginian. But here's the problem. Not only have you created a North-South dynamic, not only do we see this developing slowly, but we also see something else. We see this idea that Jefferson's policies, especially with the Embargo Act, are not benefiting one section of the country to the benefit of another, right? Southerners see the Jefferson administration and the beginning of Madison's administration as in their best interest, right? Because there is this interest of expanding into the West. Remember, immigrants coming into the country looking for new land to start their commercial farms in the West tend to vote Republican. Federalists, more and more, tend to be tied to New England's port cities. In other words, if you're a Federalist, you see the policies of Jefferson, the purchase of Louisiana, as the death stroke for your political party. And with the War of 1812 to come, that's exactly what happens, okay? Now, there are, in Jefferson's party, after he leaves office, a series of young congressmen, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster among them, who we will refer to as the War Hawks, who literally pushed the United States and the Madison administration eventually into the War of 1812. Now, we have to understand something first about the scenario. Why did we become involved in a war that probably didn't need to be fought? Well, the impressment of American sailors on the high seas was one reason for us becoming involved in the War of 1812. Native American attacks on the frontier that had plagued Western settlers for years, right? Jay's Treaty was supposed to remove the forts and the British presence that were inciting the Native Americans. But a Native American chief by the name of Tecumseh has created a pan-Native American or pan-Indian alliance in the West, in places like Ohio, for example. And so the Native American attacks on the frontier are another reason, and the fear that they're being incited by the British is another reason for us becoming involved in the War of 1812. The desire for America's continued expansion, possibly into Canada, another reason for the War of 1812. So we have to think about this for just a moment, right? When we think about the War of 1812, right, and those are the causes that we just listed, right? Impressment, the incitement of the Native Americans, the continued British troop presence in frontier forts, and the desire for Americans to expand their horizons, so to speak, at least from a geographical extent. Federalists living in places like New England, right? If we go to war with Great Britain, they're already suffering from a lack of trade with Great Britain. Now, all of a sudden, the Federalist way of life, the New England way of life, looks like it's coming to a halt. So when the War of 1812 is fought, New Englanders are not going to participate at all. It's going to be citizens from the South and the West who largely are going to participate in the military efforts of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was fought in three phases. First, Americans tried to unsuccessfully invade Canada in the first phase of the war and are defeated by British forces. However, Americans win major victories at, for example, the Battle of the Thames and the Battle of Tippecanoe, and basically destroy Tecumseh's pan-Indian alliance. What does that allow for? American expansion into the Midwestern states of today as the Native Americans are removed beyond the Mississippi River in the north. However, in the second phase of the War of 1812, things go poorly for the Americans. Things go from bad to worse. While the invasion of Canada had not gone as planned, it had been a disaster in most respects, now all of a sudden, the Americans themselves, our country is invaded. Washington, D.C. is burned to the ground. You see, Napoleon abdicates in 1814. He leaves his throne. He's defeated at the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813 in what would be Germany today. So therefore, with no Napoleon to deal with on the European continent, British forces are able to concentrate on the Americans here in the War of 1812. In 1814, they score a pair of smashing victories at the Battle of Bladensburg in particular, and right outside of Washington, D.C., that enable the British to actually capture the capital of Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. It's interesting, right, that this occurs in September of 1814. The only lifeline that the Americans have is the port city of Baltimore that's surrounded by British forces. The British naval bombardment of Fort McHenry, protecting the inlet to the port city of Baltimore, holds out against a British attack. And that's where we actually receive our national anthem, from that stand protecting the port city of Baltimore by Francis Scott Key as he is watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry unsuccessfully by British forces from a ship in the harbor. The third phase of the War of 1812 occurs in the West. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Andrew Jackson makes a national name for himself. But he also defeats a combined Native American force at Horseshoe Bend in what would be Alabama today, and that ends Native American resistance in the lower South, beginning the process of later Native American removal under Andrew Jackson when he becomes President of the United States, but also opening up the lower South for the development of the Cotton Kingdom after the War of 1812 in the near-term future. Jackson also wins the final battle of the War of 1812, and a set of curious circumstances occur. It's not up here, but it should be. The Hartford Convention. You see, at the end of the year of 1814, it looked like things were not going well for the Americans, and in fact, we were actually negotiating at Ghent in Belgium to try to bring the War of 1812 to a close. At the same time, delegates are meeting in Hartford, Connecticut from New England who had been opposed to the war from the beginning. Now, the Hartford Convention wanted to create several amendments to the Constitution. First, they wanted to end the dominance of Virginia in having the presidency of the United States. They wanted to change how Congress worked in terms of representation because they saw their section of the country as becoming underrepresented. However, they also, it appeared to be advocating for secession. There is this sense that the Federalist Party, which had not participated in the war, or the states that were largely supportive of that party, had not participated in the war. And when Jackson's victory at New Orleans comes into Washington, D.C., so does the news of the Hartford Convention. It effectively ends the Federalist Party as a viable political voice in American politics. Why? Because when the news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans is received by the American public, so is the news of the peace treaty that's been negotiated to end the war in Belgium. So most Americans conflate the two events together. Jackson wins at New Orleans, war comes to an end. And even though the War of 1812 was possibly a series of disastrous military reversals for the young United States, most Americans saw it as an American victory at the time. Andrew Jackson becomes a national hero, and his victory at New Orleans possibly kept the Europeans, especially the British, from regaining a foothold into the American West and stymieing American expansion in that direction as the country would grow later on, even during his presidency. And so the War of 1812 really opened up a new phase in American life that brings us to the Civil War. Why? Well, let's think about this for a moment, right? So we have a growing now, because of the territory opened up after the War of 1812, a growing agrarian South based on the growth of the Cotton Kingdom. In the North during the War of 1812, because trade had come to a halt with the British, we have the growth of textile industries that are taking advantage of Southern cotton. So America's Industrial Revolution begins at the end of the War of 1812. So we have two different Americas that are developing coming out of this conflict. One that's based on industrial development and commercial farming. Another that's based on the development of the Cotton Kingdom that actually facilitated the growth of the early textile industries in the North. If you're an American politician coming out of the War of 1812, such as Henry Clay, the young Speaker of the House, you begin the process of looking at how to use the power of the federal government in the same measure as Hamilton had wanted to use it 20 years earlier, right? Henry Clay at this time creates what is called his American system. Now, not all of these measures in 1816 and 1817 get passed, but the federal government was supposed to, with the American system, build the infrastructure to design a market economy on a national level. What does that mean? It meant that the federal government would be involved in the creation of infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, right? So that you could do what? Link together market towns for trade across the country, right? Who was supposed to pay for this? American taxpayers. Who was supposed to fund these initiatives? The federal government. What does that mirror? Well, it mirrors, for example, the creation of the interstate highway system in the 1950s or the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad during the 1860s, right?